Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our second Small Woodland Owners Group webinar. Today, we are lucky enough to be joined by Kay Haw from the UK Squirrel Accord. We'll be learning about invasive species. We've all been reading about Asian hornets in the news at the moment. So let's find about other types. Over to you, Kay. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, so I'm going to spend the first half talking about invasive species generally, and then with a look at some specifics, and then the next half kind of concentrating on what I do mainly now, which are grey squirrels. But when I worked for the Woodland Trust, I did cover quite a few different invasive species. So invasive non-native species, they are introduced species. They're not originally from the UK. They were brought over not of their own accord, and it's human-induced kind of introductions. They're introduced to areas where they would not necessarily or would not have naturally have been able to spread, and they cause negative impacts. So they spread rapidly. They have no control in their in their home countries. They may have diseases, predators, grazers that would naturally keep them under control, or the conditions where they live, they wouldn't been able to spread outside those areas. But unfortunately, they get moved to new areas and they have no natural control mechanisms. And they're also able to utilize those new areas much more easily. And so they tend to really get hold and start spreading rapidly. It's really important to say that not all non-native species are invasive. We sometimes get called species fascists for working on non-native species issues, but only around 10% of non-native species cause serious environmental, economic, or societal damage and are therefore called invasive. There are so many thousands of non-native species that are able to live with native species and not cause those problems. However, as the world changes and the climate changes, it may be that some of those species in the future are able to become invasive because of those changing environmental conditions. And they are one of the big drivers of biodiversity loss around the world. So that alongside habitat loss and destruction and climate change. And the cost of the UK economy was estimated a few years ago to cost around £1.8 billion. And that's quite a conservative estimate. As the cost of living has gone up for everybody, I imagine that cost has gone up now as well. This might look like a little bit of a confusing diagram, but what you've got on the left-hand side is the area of infestation. Along the bottom, you've got the timeline, and along the right-hand side, you've got the control costs. So essentially, this is how easy it is to manage an invasive species. So your best management method is basically prevention. So there are lots of people that are doing a lot of horizon scanning at the moment to see what invasive species may be able to come into this country through trade or travel, and working on ways to prevent them getting here in the first place. If you do have a species come over and you realize rapidly and quickly that it's here and it's only in a small localized area, then eradication is quick and it's easy, and it doesn't take too much time and resources. However, once a species become established, you can move more towards the right of the graph. And then you're looking at containment, you're looking at trying to contain those species if they're causing the least amount of damage. And those really established widespread species, you're looking at long-term management plans, but that's much more cost heavy and far, far less effective. So essentially you want to prevent them coming in the first place. But for a lot of species we've got in this country, and for some of the ones I'm going to look at, we have already got them. They're already established and they're already costing a lot of time and money to have to manage them. I've got to highlight the GB Non-Native Species Secretariat. It's a government team. They're a fantastic team. They're all into awareness raising and action. They've got an information portal. If you go onto www.nonnativespecies.org, you can find ID sheets, risk assessments, contingency planning, all sorts of things around non-native species and issues. They have a list of local action groups that may or may not be in your area, and that you may or may not be able to link in with, or you could start your own local action group, and they try and support those, and there's a new kind of facilitator of those within their team. And they have an invasive species week every year. So it's on May every year. And they continue to try and push for and raise awareness of the invasive species issue across the UK. So one of those species that you may be well aware of is Himalayan balsam. It's a really beautiful plant. It's very popular with bees, and therefore beekeepers like to spread it around, unfortunately. And it was first introduced in 1839 to Kew Gardens. It's got a widespread distribution across the UK. It grows rapidly, it spreads quickly. If you can see these seed pods, the flowers are very pretty, but they turn into these seed pods, and those seed pods explode. So if a droplet of water drops on them, if something moves and rubs past them, they explode and fling those seeds far and wide, many meters further than the original plant. And because they're also a major problem on riverbanks and in areas that have flooding problems, the seeds are picked up and they're washed all about the place. So they're very, very easily spread. However, despite them being popular for bees, they've got very shallow roots. And along riverbanks, what you get is you get them growing up all through the spring and the summer, and then a big die-off during the autumn and winter. The dying off of those plants then that wash into the waterways cause flooding and blockages further down the river systems. And also they then leave no roots to hold the riverbanks in place. So you get, on flood events, you get the riverbanks just being washed away and destabilized. And there's a real problem with other plants not therefore being able to live on those riverbanks to provide shade, shelter, food for species. And because the bees favour those over natural, native plants, they also have a greater competitive advantage then. It is an offence to plant or introduce it into the wild. However, as you can tell, it does escape quite easily from gardens. But you can help the situation by pulling out the plants. You want to do it before the seed pods develop, because once they've developed, then they will be flinging seeds everywhere while you're trying to do that work. But before they develop, if you see it just before or when the flowers are there, they're very shallow rooted. You can pull them out really, really easily. I do it whenever I see some. But ideally, what you really want to be doing it is at a catchment level. So looking at where it is at the top of the catchment and working down so that you're eradicating it and removing it and not allowing it to spread. I know there's been a couple of places where they've really achieved that, but it has taken a lot of work and a collaborative effort. Again, that's what the local action groups are fantastic for. Rhododendron, missed out an N on dendron, that's fine. But rhododendron, again, another very, very beautiful plant. You see it a lot in people's gardens. You see it taking over the woodland areas. It was first recorded in the wild in 1894. And this takes a lot of time and effort to get rid of this because it isn't shallow rooted. It's deep rooted. And it's hard, and it will grow back, and it will and will proliferate again. There was a bit of an uproar when National Trust tried to, have got rid of it from Lundy Island, because it used to be all along the banks of Lundy Island, and people loved seeing it. But there was nothing else growing because it's so dense. Nothing else grows underneath it. It also sends out toxins into the soil that prevent other plants from growing. But as nothing really eats it, it's quite poisonous to animals. There's no insects or plants or animals that really eat on it. There's nothing to control it. So actually, you're denuding your whole environment by not offering plants that animals can survive on. And it starts to dominate and it pushes other things out. Unfortunately, it also hosts Phytophthora, which is a tree disease, which you may have heard of in terms of infecting larch trees and the Phytophthora outbreaks on larch trees and the huge clear fells that we've had to do across the country to get rid of that. So not only does it not support wildlife, it also carries diseases. And you can remove it by cutting it down, by burning the stems, and by injecting the stems with glyphosate. But it's quite a difficult to get rid of. Giant hogweed. We often get hogweed and cow parsley in this country, none of which grows to above the height of this gentleman. It was first recorded in the wild in 1828. It's been deliberately planted by rivers and ponds, and the seeds are dispersed by wind and water and humans. It does, again, like the rhododendron, it creates dense stands that reduces the species diversity underneath it. Unfortunately, it's quite hard to deal with because it has this phytotoxic sap within it. And that if you get that on your skin, like a friend of mine did, and then you have your skin out in the sunlight, it causes the skin to burn, and it can actually become worse with more sunlight over time, and you have to give it time to heal. So definitely use of special PPE during any removal work with giant hogweed, and definitely kind of, you know, making sure you dispose of it very carefully. There have been reports of children thinking this is a great thing to pick and you know, sword fight with, but again they've just been covered in sap and unfortunately cause these skin burning. So it's a kind of public health problem, this one, as well as an environmental problem. The Asian hornet, you might have heard lots about recently. In the news, they did a real push on it. Is it last week or the week before? And this is an alert species. So this is a species that's on the continent at the moment, causing real problems. And it's smaller and more black than the native hornet. So the native hornet is actually the one at the top, and the Asian hornet is the one at the bottom. So if you look, it's got more. It's blacker and less red than the European hornet, and on the thorax, on the back bit where the sting is, it's got more black and less yellow than the European hornet. But it's a real predator of bees and other pollinators. In Asia, the Asian bee has actually learned to deal with this by, once you get a sentinel hornet coming in to try and find a hive, they'll let it come into the hive. But then they'll surround it, and then they'll buzz around it, and they'll heat it up, and they can survive temperatures just above that of the hornet. And so a couple of bees might die, but essentially they cook the hornet to death, so that the hornet can't then go back to its nest and tell all the other hornets where those bees are, and then come and they'll behead them and take all their wings off and things. But that's the risk we have in this country, and that's what's happening in France at the moment. They tend to build their nest in deciduous trees, but they can also build them in holes and buildings. And if you see any of these, please report it as soon as possible, if not immediately, using the Asian Hornet Watch app or emailing alert non-native at ceh.ac.uk so that they can come out and they can deal with this. There are rapid response teams waiting for your call so that they can come out and deal with this. And there have been reports this year, but all the nests have been dealt with, which is fantastic. I don't know whether we'll ever be able to really deal with it if we don't get a handle on it in the continent, but we're trying at the moment to keep it from getting established in this country. So on to the grey squirrel. Now, this is one of those established and widespread species that costs a lot of time and money to manage. It was introduced to England and Ireland from 1876, and it's introduced to Italy in 1948. So you may think, well, England and Ireland, we're islands, you know, if the red squirrel's lost from here, maybe that's not a massive issue because it's got a big population on the Euro-Asian and Eurasia. But if they spread across and then move out of Italy, that is the main stronghold for the red squirrel. And that's a full kind of species level extinction event, potentially. People realized by 1930 that they were causing massive problems. And so a law was passed prohibiting the importation and keeping. But again, like I say, they require serious conservation time and effort to manage them. These maps show you from 1945 to 2000 to 2010, just the spread of the grey squirrel. They really have pushed the red squirrel out of large areas, most of England, most of Wales, much, you know, but large areas of Scotland, unfortunately, and large areas of Northern Ireland and Ireland. Although the situation in some cases is looking slightly more positive than this, and we're having some new maps drawn up to show what the situation is like now. So in terms of their negative impacts, they are much larger and more aggressive than red squirrels, and they will chase them off food. They will compete with them for food and habitat, and they cause local extinctions just through that competition. However, they also carry squirrelpox virus, and in the presence of squirrelpox, red squirrels will die out 25 times faster than with competition alone. Unfortunately, the grey squirrels are only carriers of the disease. They don't contract it, but it's almost always fatal to red squirrels. And once it hits a population, it can wipe out 80 to 90% of a red squirrel population really, really quickly. Now, I think if it was just a species on species issue, that some people would say, well, let's give up. You know, there is no point in carrying on trying to just, you know, protect red squirrels. They have, you know, like I said, they had the Eurasian continent. Unfortunately, grey squirrels are also a massive issue for broadleaf trees. They bark strip and rip away the protective layer of bark from trees to get at the sap underneath. And they generally target trees about 10 to 50 years old, broadleaf trees of 10 to 50 years old. They have been known to go down to, you know, young ones at 7 years old and above. But they cause damage, stress, and can kill a large number of trees through this bark stripping damage. So because of those double whammy, because of the impacts they're having on red squirrels, because of the impacts they're having on broadleaf trees and woodland ecosystems, the UK Squirrel Accord was established in 2015, and we're a partnership of 45 different signatories from all over the UK. And we're essentially trying to protect red squirrels, tree health, and woodland ecosystems by reducing the negative impacts of the grey squirrels. And as you can see, this is a montage of the different logos of the different organisations that are involved. We've got statutory organisations from the different UK countries, large national conservation organisations, forestry organisations. And it really does take this, especially when you're talking about a species so well established, when you're talking about a grey squirrel that's in well into the millions of grey squirrels in this country. This is what you need. You need this collaborative effort of working together. So yes, like I said, trees are around 10 to 50 years of age. They're mostly broadleaf trees, and a study by a report by the RFS, the Royal Forestry Society, of their members said that the survey said that their members think that grey squirrels are the greatest threat to broadleaf trees, above that of deer and disease at the moment. And we're getting a lot of there's a real push in this country to plant more broadleaf trees, to move away from so much of the monoculture conifer plantations, to plant more broadleaf or mixed, you know, forests. But a lot of people are reluctant to do that because of the impacts that the grey squirrel are having. They're saying, what is the point of me planting all these trees when actually they're going to come in and destroy a lot of them? There was a report done, using the National Forest Inventory data, which estimated that the damage in England and Wales alone costs at least £37 million a year. That's in lost timber value, damage mitigation, replacement trees for those that are lost, but also the impact on carbon capture. So denuded, damaged, stressed trees are not capturing as much carbon as healthy trees if they're able to grow and mature. What we don't quite have a value on is the knock-on impacts, because it's not just economically important trees they're damaging, they're ecologically important trees. So like our oak tree that supports 2,300 species, more species than any other tree in the UK. And oak trees are one of those trees that grey squirrels will come in, will impact, will kill off. I've been into a forest, I've been into a wood in the National Forest, and almost all of those oak trees will not survive and make it to maturity. And if they do, they will be far, far more damaged than they should be. So what is the knock-on impact if we're not going to have those ecologically important trees, or we're going to have a much reduced tree species diversity in a woodland? What is the knock-on impact for biodiversity and for the ecosystem, other ecosystem services that they provide? And we've got a PhD on that starting at York University next month, so that should be interesting to find out. If you want to find out about the damage in your woodland, the National Forest created a grey squirrel impact and assessment methodology and recording sheet. So this is a way for you to go through your wood and use a methodology, a standard methodology, to find out what's going on in your wood. And actually, this work is now part of the Forestry Commission's WS3 grant that you can access to pay for grey squirrel management. I think it's £50 per hectare per year. But you have to complete this as part of that grant requirement. And what it is just a recording sheet. And then you go through using methodology I'll go through in a minute, and you record all of the data using this sheet on the right hand side, which says, you know, is there what kind of damage is there? Is it a little bit of damage? So is one of those like coin-sized flakes of bark was removed from the tree, which is essentially usually a tester patch, because what they like to go for is the healthiest and most vigorous trees because it's got the best sap. So they'll take out your best trees, but they'll find out using a tester patch first whether that is one of the trees they want to go for. And if they like it, they'll then go through and maybe do all the way up to 5, which is where that tree will not survive. The top of that will fall out, which is also a public health and safety issue, as well as a tree loss issue. So using the methodology, what you do is a simple line transect through your woodland site. If you've got a GPS, you can record the transect and the different stops you use along the way. So you're then trying to do the same transect each year, the same stops each year. So then you can compare and contrast the damage across different years and see whether, if you've implemented any new grey squirrel management, if that's having an impact, or if your damage in your woodland is getting worse. You want about 1 stop per hectare and a minimum of 3 stops. So this one wood on the right hand side is 11 hectares woodland. It's 11 survey stops. And when you stop at your first stop, and all of your stops, what you want to do is pick the 5 trees that are closest to you with 7 centimeters diameter at breast height, and assess what damage there is to those trees, and take some binoculars along so you can look all the way up into the canopy, because as I said, they will bark strip right from the bottom all the way up into the canopy. And then you can put it on a recording sheet, or you can use a tablet, and by putting in those numbers, that spreadsheet will give you a figure at the end, which will tell you relatively how badly your damage how badly your wood is or is not being damaged. And it's really useful if you do it on a yearly basis, then you can compare and contrast that. And again, like I said, it's a requirement of the WS3 grant if you access that. So in terms of grey squirrel management, what we have at the moment are lethal methods. They are shooting and trapping, either using kill traps or using live trapping and then dispatch. However, a survey was done of the general British public in 2018 to look at people's preferences for different grey squirrel management methods. Poisoning, which is on the far right, is not available anymore. Shooting and killing, anything to do with people killing animals, because these are iconic, charismatic species. People love squirrels, and it's hard for people to see them killed or to want them killed. So shooting, trapping, and poisoning were the least acceptable methods of management, but we don't have anything else at the moment. I know the pine marten is making some of a comeback in this country, and around Great Britain and Northern Ireland and Ireland, but they're very slow breeding species, and they won't be a silver bullet. I think some people think that the pine marten will come in and be the answer to all grey squirrel management, and they just won't. Also, the most effective invasive species eradications require 3 different methods, and you use 3 different methods. And so for this, it could be shooting and trapping, along with a biological control such as pine marten, and then with a contraception option if it is developed, if and when it's developed, which is the most acceptable method to the British public of managing grey squirrels, which is on the left-hand side. So what we're doing as the UK Squirrel Accord is working to develop an oral contraceptive and a species-specific feeding hopper. And you can see the feeding hopper on the right-hand side here. It's being funded by ourselves and our supporters and delivered by the Animal and Plant Health Agency researchers. And what we want to offer is this non-lethal, cost-effective, less labour-intensive, because it is a widespread and established species, more publicly acceptable, alternative or complementary method. So it could work alongside trapping and shooting, so you're doing those 2 things and pine marten together, or you could use it as a complete alternative for those places maybe where people just don't want to use lethal methods at all. So on the right-hand side, you can see the feeding hopper. That at the moment is just a weighted door that the grey squirrel pushes open and accesses a bait, which at the moment doesn't have any oral contraceptive in it, but will hopefully in the future contain something that will cause infertility. We're also looking at, in red squirrel areas, because some of the heavier red squirrels can push the door open, to look at a weighted platform so that actually most animals are within a certain weight range. We're gathering lots and lots of grey and red squirrel rates from around the country, and they'd stand on that platform, and the door would only open if the animal was within a certain weight range, so you could exclude anything that wasn't within the grey squirrel weight range. And the other thing we're looking at is the potential for colour code scanners. So the grey squirrel coloured coats often show more in the blue light spectrum. But again, that's something that we'll look at if we have to. But the weighted door is the most cost effective. And then we'd look at the weighted platform. So the oral contraceptive that we've been looking at, we have had a look at diazepam, which is a cholesterol inhibitor, and you need cholesterol to create the sex hormone, so progesterone, estrogen, and testosterone. And if you haven't got enough cholesterol, you basically become infertile. But unfortunately, diazepam, it doesn't taste very nice, and we couldn't make it with all of the taste maskers, we still couldn't make it in such a way that the grey squirrels would eat enough of it. EP1 is something that we've been having a look at as a potential if what we're doing at the moment doesn't work, but that's a hormone-based contraceptive. But the focus at the moment is this immunocontraceptive. So it inhibits the gonadotrophin releasing hormone, so that's released from the hypothalamus. And if you stop that being released, that's the precursor to all the sex hormones. So if the body doesn't release that, it doesn't create any of the sex hormones and you would cause infertility. At the moment, there's a successful injectable form of that being used around the world for wild horses in America, for elephants in Africa in a reservation. But what we need to do is turn it into an oral form that survives being eaten, goes through the gut without being digested and destroyed, and makes it into the bloodstream. And that's our work at the moment. So in conclusion, invasive non-native species are major national and global problems, and we definitely need to manage and reduce their impacts if we are to protect biodiversity and our ecosystem services. It's really important to understand the problem on your land, to go out and have a good idea of what the issues are that you're personally having to deal with, and maybe have a wider look at what the issues are on your neighbour's land as well, if you're speaking to your neighbours, and see if there's something there that you can work together on. We need collaborative landscape scale action on a lot of these, especially those widespread and established species. But if you've got something that's a rapid alert species and you notice it, definitely report that and get rid of it as soon as possible. And there is support available. So through the GB Non-Native Species Secretariat, you can go on their website, you can have a look at all of the different species that might be out there. You can see if there's a local action group in your area that might be able to come and help you do some of the removal work or the management work. If you're in a red squirrel area, there are always many red squirrel community groups that will be able to come and help you with your grey squirrel problem. And there are also grants out there. So I mentioned the WS3 grant through the Forestry Commission. Forestry and Land Scotland have a grant for managing grey squirrels if you're in a red squirrel area in Scotland. The National Forest has a grey squirrel management grant specifically for the National Forest. But it's worth looking into what kind of other support you might be able to get. So thanks very much for listening. That was a bit of a whistle-stop tour through invasive species. But yeah, if you want to know more about our squirrel work, we've got a website, www.squirrelaccord.uk, or email me at info@squirrelaccord.uk.
Thank you very much, Kay. Yeah, very enlightening. I've got a question.
Oh, I can't hear you again, Sarah.
Oh. What about now?
No.
Okay.
I'll stop sharing my screen.
Okay. Can you hear me now? No joy.
Is it just me?
Okay. Other people can hear me. Yeah, it's just UK. Have you got your sound turned down? She can't hear me.
Perhaps you'll have to type your question for her, Sarah.
Yeah, that's good.
If she's looking at her chat.
Yeah. You can do the chat on the phone app. All right.
In the meantime.
Okay.
There you go. I can hear you now again.
Oh, okay. My question to you, Kay. Well, firstly, I was saying thank you very much. Thank you for your talk. Very enlightening. Whatever the contraceptive tastes like that tastes so revolting, could that be painted on the bark in like sort of wax, to stop them nibbling and doing their little squirrel tapas on the trees?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know whether anyone's ever thought of that. You'd have to, I mean, it would be a massive job to try and paint many trees. I guess if you had, a specimen tree particularly, and they started, impacting a small number of trees, you could probably choose to do something to those trees specifically. But I think if you've got a huge woodland, it's maybe
practical. Yeah. Well, we do have some questions in the chat. Can you access those questions, Kay? Can you see them?
Yes.
The rest of you, if you do have questions and you'd like to type them in now, then now's your chance.
I thought red squirrels couldn't digest acorns, oak. We've looked into every Red Squirrel Haven, Northwest Small Woodland. I can't remember who we approached. We were told the mature oak acorn wasn't food for the red squirrel, so our wood wasn't suitable. Is that incorrect? I know that grey squirrels can eat acorns before they're completely ripe, whereas red squirrels, I believe, have to wait till they're far more ripe, and that's why oak trees tend to give grey squirrels a competitive advantage over the red squirrel, and they kind of decimate. I don't think acorns are their favorite foods. I think hazelnuts and things like that are more red squirrels' favored food, but I believe once they've become kind of more ripe, they can manage it. But they've got quite a lot of tannins in them, acorns, which are not they're not liked by, particularly by the red squirrels.
Okay.
But I think they do also like mixed woodland as well, with different things you can offer them. Are there any tree species that could act as a sacrificial crop or to graze just like all broadleaf? People have used things like field maple as a bit of a sacrificial crop, and there are a couple of other ones I think that people have used. But I tend to, I mean, in the national forest wood that I go in to kind of do some bit of recording, they've decimated the field maple and the oak, and I think the field maple was planted near the oak to use it as a kind of a bit of a sacrificial crop, but they've just gone for all of it. I guess it depends on the densities as well you're looking at. So if you're looking at high density levels of grey squirrels, they're just going to come in and kind of hammer a lot of it, I think. But
ironically, they'll be even more well fed and they'll prosper even more than if they're filling their belly. That's
it. So we said I find the fox does a good job. Yeah, I mean, I haven't heard of foxes predating too much on grey squirrels, but they are kind of ground feeders. So I mean, foxes will go for anything, won't they? If they can get their fangs on it. I think pine marten and goshawk tend to be the most talked about predators for the grey squirrels. Again, but grey squirrels aren't they're ground feeders, and they're kind of more easy prey for pine marten than red squirrels. Grey squirrels also haven't evolved with pine marten, so don't recognize the pine marten as a scent, as a danger. Whereas the red squirrel, if they smell pine marten, they know that that's a problem, and they'll run away from it. And but the grey squirrels are kind of oblivious, and it's actually only when the pine marten chases them that they realize that they're suddenly prey. Nothing. I did not realize there were grants for grey squirrel management. I believe there are grants for rhododendron. Is this also through WGS? Potentially, I'm not entirely sure about the grants for rhododendron, but I know that with elms and other bits, they are looking to pay people for more invasive species management within woodlands, and encouraging people to manage their woodlands with it, which includes in managing and removing the invasive species. A license is needed for trapping on a private site. No, I mean, as long as you're using an approved trap, you should be able to just trap on your site. There's a document done by British Red Squirrel on their website that goes through the different licensed traps that are available and out there for people to use, which might be useful for people. How many squirrels in an acre of typical woodlands? I've never seen one in the year, but we've had our wood, but we've seen them on trail cams. It depends. It depends on the number of squirrels there, the amount of food that's available to them, whether they're prospering in that area. Honestly, I couldn't tell you off the top of my head because it is so variable. But one of the things that my colleague Sarah Beethan in the APHA has just done is to design a grey squirrel density survey methodology, which uses wildlife cameras to assess how many grey squirrels are in a wood. So therefore, you know the level of the problem that you're trying to deal with. And one of the things that we're looking to do is design a suite of activities that volunteers can do, so to connect with the Accord, the UK Squirrel Accord, and to look at maybe doing kind of density and damage surveys to see how much correlation there is between a certain level of density of squirrel and the amount of damage that's being done to a woodland. I found in my woodlands the grey squirrels prefer the small leaf lime. Yeah, small leaf lime is another one. Ash trees apparently used to be one of the lesser damaged trees, but unfortunately with all of the, ash dieback we've now got, that's become one of those trees that people can't plant, unfortunately. Yeah, I've noticed my sycamore's decimated, but I think of them as a weed tree anyway, so I don't care. Not noticed my oaks have been attacked. You might be lucky. It depends how old they are as well. They might have gone past the age where they're at, the bark becomes, at a certain age, the bark becomes too dense and thick and tough for them to chew through. But maybe your sycamores have acted as that sacrificial tree in that woodland. Are there particular target areas for controlling greys, or is the problem everywhere? I mean, red squirrel areas, there is a lot of work going on in red squirrel areas because of the impact on the red squirrel and to try and save and protect our remaining red squirrels. But even in grey squirrel only areas, especially with the new planting targets that we've got in the UK, where people are really focused on trying to manage grey squirrels to protect the new trees. And it isn't just the kind of like woodland creation sites. You'll also have where you've got a more mature woodland, you'll still have that kind of woodland regeneration coming through, and you might get impacts on that as well. But yeah, I mean, anywhere there's a grey squirrel, there's a kind of a problem of some kind. From our experience, the grey squirrels reproduce at such a rate they can't see sacrificial will be useful. Just watching them rinsing hedges of chicks from nests, yeah. They're very good foragers, hunters, also plum and damson. They also eat hawthorn berries at the moment. I don't know if they do so much damage. They do. Yeah, they're quite omnivorous squirrels generally. They're quite opportunistic as well. I mean, there have been studies done on their impacts on bird species, and some of them have been inconclusive, and some of them say they have no significant impact. But then I've heard others that have said, I cleared the grey squirrels out of a wood and now I can hear the bird song has increased massively, and the number of birds I've got in my woodland has increased. So I think they do. I mean, they will take chicks from nests, but I don't know the full impact of the damage that's having on bird species generally. Would you happen to know why the Canea trap is no longer available in the UK? Yeah, unfortunately, I mean, this is something that's put on the end of a trap so that it dispatches the squirrel without you having to do it yourself, and lots of people found them really useful, but the company that made them stopped making them or went into receivership or something like that. So they're no longer being made, but I think there are people looking at the moment to try and bring them back in some way, to try and make them and return them to being manufactured. So hopefully, because they were really, really useful and a lot of people found them really useful. Cherry laurel wasn't covered. No, I just picked a few species that I thought might be, might a lot of people might know or find in their woods. But we can also, I mean, if you wanted me to cover other species in the future, I'm quite happy to do that.
Yeah, I think that could be something we could discuss, Kay. I think we'll have the interest for it, I'm sure.
Yeah. Are you interested in research location for fertility control research trials? So the landscape scale trials that we'll be doing, which are very focused and using very expensive researcher time, are going to have to be, well, they will have to be quite focused and quite constrained. But this is what we want to do with this suite of activities that we're putting together, that will be a range of activities that anybody can do across the country. And that what we want is for it not just to be an engagement tool, but also a data collection tool. And that information will feed into our work and feed into our modelling work. So we'll have a better idea of what the problem is, the scale of the problem, what's being done, what could be done in the future, and it will all feed into that modelling. So hopefully, yes, people will be able to in the future feed into that work. Do they damage apple, plum, and other fruit trees? I don't know can't remember off the top of my head. I mean, I know they'll eat the fruit, and they'll take the cherries, won't they, in bits and pieces like that, like the birds were. There is a there is a table on the UK Squirrel Accord website, which I'll try and find, and then I'll put it up, because it was done by a gentleman, a forester, who did a lot of work on looking at the different impacts of squirrel damage, and whether I don't know whether I'll be able to just put that into the chat. Oh, there we go. So that table I've just put into the chat was done by Graham Taylor of Prior and Rickett Silviculture, who also is the chair of the European Squirrel Initiative. And he put it into different levels of susceptibility. I think they're mainly, I mean, crab apples in a low susceptibility and wild cherries low susceptibility. But then you've got your highs like your oaks, your poplars, your sweet chestnut, your willow, your birch, and things like that. But that's a really useful table. My woodland also has the main River Trent. So also, oh yes, I've seen a lot of issues with the Himalayan balsam along the River Trent. And the river also has the American crayfish. Yeah, it's a real shame with the American crayfish. I know they're doing a lot of work to try and breed the native crayfish to put them back out into the rivers. One of the things that's being looked at the moment is gene drive work, which is gene editing, which is more controversial than contraception. But it's editing the gene very finely so that you'd create male, for example, if you were doing it with grey squirrels, you'd create male grey squirrels that would go out, that you put out into the wild, that would only produce more grey squirrels. So you'd eventually just get a population crash because you've got no breeding adults in the end, because you'd have no females. Now, it's something that's many, many years into the future, and there's a feasibility study being funded by the Forestry Commission to look at it for grey squirrels. But I know that it's something that's being looked at for American crayfish. They're looking at it in Australia for the mouse plague there. People are looking at it for rats and all sorts of things. So yeah, I think it's quite a distance, maybe a couple of decades or so away. But that is something that people are interested in. But yeah, I've noticed a lot of Himalayan balsam along the Trent, unfortunately. Once trapped, what method do people use to kill the squirrel? Some people shoot them, and then others, they get them into a bag, and they get them to the end of the bag, and they basically hit them over the head, and it's supposed to be like a one clean hit. But it is not a very nice, and this is why a lot of people are kind of like reluctant to do that kind of work, and why I think we do really need to find alternatives. I mean, some people are worried that the alternatives means that nobody will want to do trapping and shooting. If that is the case, that's the case in the future. But, you know, more and more people are becoming vegetarians, becoming vegans, they're becoming animal rights activists. And I think, you know, science and technology is evolving, and we need to move with it and look at, you know, not finding alternatives, but also things that then can be used together. Because at the moment, trapping and shooting is just not having you know, the grey squirrel population is kind of going up at the moment. Cherry laurel widespread in mine from neighbours' woods. Are there no controls? If you look at the new invasive species legislation, I think there are things you can do if your neighbour's having an impact, if an invasive species is having an impact in your wood. There are measures you can take, and I think it has to go through the authorities. But it'd be worth looking into that a bit more. because my stepdad were having issues with their neighbours with the bamboo, and I think they looked into it, the potential to maybe report the issue. If you've gone through all the kind of normal channels of please can you get rid of this and please can you stop it coming into my garden, that you can actually go through some legal channels to say that there's an issue, because I think it is, you're not supposed to let invasive species out into your neighbouring land. Is there a risk of animals that predate on squirrels that have eaten the contraceptive also being affected by it? So that is something that we're going to have to look at as part of the study. But what we believe at the moment is that the contraceptive we're working with will go into the system and have an impact on the squirrels, but it will break down in the system to the point where it won't affect, say, if a badger ate a grey squirrel, or if a bird, not in the same way that poisoning used to have an effect, that the poison would kill the squirrel and then the poison would often kill whatever predated or scavenged that animal as well. So yeah, but it is definitely something we'll have to look at to make sure it's safe. We don't want to put anything that's not safe out into the environment. I think that's it.
Right. Well done, Kay. You've reached the questions. Thanks, everybody, for having such good questions. Oh, hang on. We've got one last one. Should we not be stopping bamboo, rhododendrons, etc., being sold?
That would be great. Yes. When I worked with the GB Non-Invasive Species Secretariat as part of the Wildlife and Countryside Link group, we looked at stopping some species being sold under a certain section of the Wildlife and Countryside Act. And we did manage to get some stopped, but unfortunately the push from trade was so great that we couldn't get enough things stopped. So we'd like to have seen rhododendron not be sold anymore, but unfortunately there's a lot of money made from it, and we didn't have the influence to stop that being sold, unfortunately.
Right. Thank you so much, Kate. If anybody has any follow-up questions, you can email sarah@swog.org.uk, and I'm in touch with Kay anyway, so I can pass any pertinent questions along. Yeah, just thank you very much. I'm going to stop.
Thank you.
And yeah, as always, everybody, check out for the rest of our SWOG webinars, and I hope you've all downloaded the Asian Hornet Watch app I said.